Camp Blood is an SOV horror movie from the year 2000 that's been on my books to cover for quite some time. I initially rescued it from a CEX about 3 years ago in the DVD bargain section. I figured it would probably be good fodder for this channel because, looking at the box art, it looked like it was going to be some kind of low-budget studio feature from the 90s. It's a killer clown movie, sure, I'll give it a punt, why not? And my God, what an underwhelming experience I found myself in. The film clocks in at around an hour and 14 minutes, so it's mercifully short, and the plot leans heavily on references and plot lines from 80s horror movies, particularly Friday the 13th, of which this film got its namesake. The film follows Trish, her boyfriend Steve, his friend Jay, and Jay's girlfriend Nicole, as they all plan to head up to Camp Blackwood for a small vacation up in the mountains. However, all is not well at Camp Blackwood. A psychopathic murderer wearing a clown mask stalks the woods claiming victims, and in the opening of the film, we not only see this masked machete-wielding terror take out a couple of birdwatchers, he also picks off a couple of hunters too. The gang hop in the car and spend an eternity driving round and ultimately end up lost, so they pull over to ask a stranger for directions, who turns out to be this movie's version of Crazy Ralph. The guy's manic, eccentric, and raves to the group about the murders up at Camp Blood and how they'd be crazy to go up there, and that they should really just head home now and save themselves. Our gang basically tell him to stop being a dickhead, and he eventually gives them specific directions on how to get up to the woods with little to no hassle. When the group finally arrives, they're to liaise with a guide called Harris. But Harris is a no-show, so the gang decide to head into the woods themselves, and because they're a smart bunch who, in the first 20 or so minutes of the film, have decided to A. ignore the mad ramblings of dollar store Crazy Ralph about a killer clown at Camp Blood, and B. head into the dense forest without a hired guide, they then decide to split up and explore in pairs. Steve and Trish decide to go for a stroll and see someone or something skulking around in the tall grass. Steve goes to investigate and gets tackled by the figure, who turns out to be none other than Harris, our AWOL guide. After a quick dusting off and a round of apologies for nearly having a bloodbath on their hands, the gang all reunite, and Jay, who I forgot to mention is a massive twat in this, he's misogynistic, homophobic and a bit racist too, well, he basically goes up like a bottle of pop at not only the fact that Harris was late, but that she is a woms? Anyway, Harris grabs him by the shirt lapels, and after a brief shake to assert dominance, Jay isn't so mad at her anymore. It's amazing how that works. Harris leads the gang to a clearing, and we're then treated to an extended character building sequence where our cast set up camp for the night. Trish confides to Steve that she's worried about all the killer clown stuff. Trish and Steve both have a bit of a heart-to-heart, as well as their relationship in recent months hasn't been the greatest. And while that's all going on, Jay and Nicole sneak off to try and do some woodland fuckery, only to get caught by Harris, who's just hanging out in a tree for some reason. Anyway, night falls, and after threatening us with a guitar, our gang gather around the campfire to hear some ghost stories. Harris opts in with the story of Camp Blood. Previously, she'd reassured Trish that there was no story of Camp Blood, but she now reveals that that was just to stop her freaking out and that there actually was a story of Camp Blood. In what's probably one of the most lamest origin stories for a killer in a slasher movie. The clown killer from Camp Blood was originally a guy by the name of Stanley Cunningham, who came home from work one day to find his wife in bed with another man. Blind with rage, Stanley tied the pair up, put them in his car and drove up to Camp Blackwood, where he led them deep into the woods and then macheted them to death whilst dressed as a clown. He then disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again, but it's thought that every so often hikers stumble onto Stanley and find the receiving end of his blade. Ooh. The gang don't really react that much to this, and the next thing we know, quite a bit of time has passed and Jay and Nicole have headed back to their tent for a little bouncy in what's frankly an awful sex scene that I can't show here really, but trust me, it's really bad. Steve and Trish are also in their tent, and Steve tries to initiate, but Trish is so spooked by the Camp Blood clown story that she's just not in the mood. So the pair just head to bed for the night. The next day though, when they wake up, Trish heads out to discover that Harris has been roasted alive on the campfire. Her screaming wakes up the rest of the gang, and between them they decide the best thing to do is to try and get back to the car and get out of there. But the killer clown is hot on their trail. In a climactic finale where it's man versus killer clown, will the gang escape the woods as a team? Who is behind the clown mask? And does the clown even exist at all, or is it all in Trish's mind? If you want to know, stick around and check out Camp Blood. I'm just going to be upfront here, this film isn't very good. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a, oh man, you gotta check this out, it's so bad kind of way. I mean it in a, I already guessed the ending about 10 minutes in and now I'm going to clock watch on and off until the credits kind of way. I originally intended to cover this movie a year or so ago, but got put off by the idea because it was so middle of the road and uninteresting. And if it wasn't for the fact that I recently invested in a box set of 11 of these movies, I don't think I'd even really be covering it now. It's just a really boring and predictable movie that isn't technically very good and isn't particularly very well executed either. But in order to give this movie a fair review and judgment, I do feel the need to clarify right from the off that this was the director and writer's first ever feature film. He'd done 2 short films before this, and I believe this was just a quick and nasty way to grease the wheels on the start of a more viable film career. It's tape. Every producer needs something that they can cut a good 10 to 30 seconds from as representation of their work running at its best. And with Camp Blood, you get the feeling that this was very much a first-time director looking to get tape and learning most of his craft in the field in real time. For starters, and we're going into spoiler territory here, but the script is all over the place. Essentially, the film can't decide which approach it wants to take about the killer clown. Initially, the film wants you to believe that it's just a generic guy in the woods kills people type movie. But then about 2/3 the way into the film, it introduces the idea that the clown killer may in fact be entirely in Trish's head. And then after introducing that element, they then go one step further in trying to reveal that Harris is the clown killer. And then to go one further than that, the final scene of the film is Trish in a mental hospital being interviewed by an FBI agent who's implying that she killed her friends in the woods and that everything we saw was just the doped up machinations of a mentally unwell person. I'll never knock someone's ambitions here, but for a more or less first-time feature scriptwriter, there is just way too much being crammed into this movie. In a more nuanced and experienced pair of hands, this still would have been messy, but it would have at least been coherent. Here, beyond stabby clown in the woods, I have no idea what's supposed to be going on beyond a surface level interpretation. And all the weird "is this really happening" bollocks, I just have to kind of tune out like radio static, because it's so badly inserted into this thing that paying attention to it just makes the film even more confusing and badly paced. That's another thing while I think about it, the pacing is all over the place too. There's reams of backstory that's just shat out in 3 to 5 minutes, and then that's immediately followed by 5 to 10 minutes of padded sequences of setting up tents, running around the woods, or character development that doesn't really matter. For a slasher, it also has a badly paced body count, with 3 bodies going down in the first 10 minutes or so, 2 more going down in a flashback around 30 to 40 minutes in, and the final 3 being taken out in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the movie in relatively quick succession. It means that there are just yawning periods in this movie where it looks more or less like someone's home movie rather than an actual slasher film. And with a body count of 8 or 9, depending on whether you count the flashbacks, which may or may not have actually happened, it's just a quite underwhelming experience to sit through. And what really doesn't help is the constant nod and winks to other horror movies peppered throughout this thing. As I said back when I covered the SOV 6-pack, if you put a small nod or wink to another horror film in your horror film, that's fine, I'll look the other way. But if your entire film would fail to properly function without references that horror fans basically spend the rest of the night whooping and pointing at the screen going, you see, that's a subtle reference to Slumber Party Massacre 2, then I'm not going to be very polite about your script. And unfortunately, Camp Blood, while not the worst offender, is definitely one of those kinds of movies. For starters, a decent chunk of the characters have names based on other franchises, with the clown killer being called Stanley Cunningham, being a reference to Sean Cunningham from Friday the 13th, one of the hunters being called Vic Miller after Victor Miller, the writer of the original Friday the 13th. Stanley's wife is called Mary Lou Maloney, a reference to Prom Night 2 Hello Mary Lou, and a doctor at the end of the film is called Dr. West, which is a reference to Reanimator. And that's before we get to the fact that the film's literally called Camp Blood in reference to Friday the 13th, that our clown killer's main weapon is a machete in reference to Friday the 13th, that the film is predominantly set in a woods and a camping ground in reference to Friday the 13th, and that the film features a Crazy Ralph knockoff in reference to Friday the 13th. The whole bloody film is just a giant reference, and because it's so dedicated to reminding you of other better movies, it just left me wishing that I was watching an actual Friday the 13th movie rather than one that has a raging boner for a Friday the 13th movie. The dialogue in this thing is probably the best element of the movie altogether. It sounds relatively fluid, and most of the characters feel no worse than any of the rubbish that got squeezed out during the vastly dire range of slashers put out in the 80s. There's some fun lines in this movie, but it's just not enough to save the thing, sadly. This film was written and directed by Brad Sykes. He has 28 writing credits, mainly for stuff he's directed himself, with titles including Witchcraft 12 and Death Factory, to name a couple. As a director, he has 25 credits, with his last film being The Pact in 2013. He has, however, contributed to 2 anthology films outside of his own main work, in late 2013 and 2018 respectively. But what should have been a red flag right from the off, taking a look at his credits, almost all of his films sit between a 3.5 and 4.5 rating on IMDb, with his highest rated film sitting at 5.6. And even more worryingly, a more than decent amount of them falling below a 3.0. I should have run away. I could have run away. The direction is unique. I think that's a fair criticism to level at this film. It's distinct in the sense that I'm not going to confuse this film with anyone else's work, but as I mentioned earlier, this just feels like someone who'd messed around with a camera only very fleetingly and was now attempting to make a feature film with no prior training in how to make a movie. And as such, the direction feels incredibly amateurish. Because it is. Because the director's learning how to shoot a movie while shooting the movie. Which means some of the fight scenes that were clearly filmed earliest look awful in terms of structuring and tone, while the majority of the film looks like it's been set up for function rather than vision. This isn't someone thinking of what shot would look best for this scene, this is someone who's thinking, how can I set this shot up so that I'll get the shot? Which is a really, really bad way to plan your movie. As a result of the limitations of SOV filmmaking and a limited understanding of the filmmaking process in general, the resulting film is a rather flat, rather lifeless affair that's just a bit drab to sit through. It has the odd flourish here and there, but you very much get the vibe that those moments were included because they look cool rather than for any specific film-driven reason. That being said, direction of the cast is about acceptable. Brad seems to get the best performances out of his core cast from a dialogue standpoint, though physical direction seems a bit limited. Which is understandable if you've never made a feature before, because learning how to physically guide your cast is arguably the hardest part of becoming a good director. There are experienced directors out there who still struggle to get the cast to physically respond in a way that's in line with their vision. Not helping matters at all is the cine, which is frankly the worst element of this film to me for a multitude of reasons, the most obvious of which is still burnt into my retinas, being the plethora of technical issues that plague this film from start to finish. Continuity is to the wall. There are scenes where our cast are driving where the car is clearly in the middle of nowhere, while interior car shots within the same sequence are being shot while someone is driving around a pleasant neighbourhood. The film regularly crosses the line, making scenes somewhat confusing to follow at times. And in what's probably the worst crime this film commits, I'm not sure if it's a filter or some kind of protective waterproof bag, but for the majority of the wood scenes there's some kind of square piece of plastic that frequently breaks into the framing that's dirty, very distracting, and could have easily been reduced if not removed. But it wasn't. Thus rendering about a third of the film about as visually pleasing as a bar toilet floor during Freshers Week. Sequences just about work, but quite often it feels like shots are missing, or used in the wrong order, or held on for too long, or not enough. I mean, you can just about make sense of what's going on for the most part, but it's just incredibly messy, and really not helped by other elements on show here. This isn't a pretty film by any stretch of the imagination. Performance-wise, I got nothing. This is the beigest range of actors I've seen in a long time. None of them stand out, none of them really define themselves outside of horror caricatures. The closest I could get to a nice piece of feedback would be levelled at Tim Young as Jay, and that would be to say that he really gets into his stereotypical douchebag role to the point that he clearly seems to be having a great time just really ramping up how big of a dick he can be before it just becomes absurd. Otherwise, the rest of the cast here are either trying to ape existing characters from other horror films, or their performances are just above porn acting. In fact, now that I think about it, this whole movie has a bit of a whiff of the SOV softcore genre about it. I think that's tonally where this film is at. And finally, the soundtrack. It's cheap. Very cheap. Stocky sounding royalty-free horror synth stings seem to be the flavour of the day. Think long chord holds, sharp synth pounds for running scenes, and great walloping gulfs of silence. Eesh. Add in some ADR that's just absolutely horrendous. It sounds like they're not even in the same reality, let alone the same location, and you've got the perfect storm for a terrible soundtrack. Cant Blood was released on VHS in the US in the year 2000. It didn't get a VHS release in Europe, instead it came out on DVD in 2002. It would also receive a version converted into Red Blue 3D in 2008 that, again, I believe was a US exclusive before it slipped into relative obscurity. It eventually resurfaced on Blu-ray as part of a double feature collection with its sequel, Cant Blood 2, courtesy of Sterling Entertainment in 2011. Where it was presented in stereoscopic 3D of all things. Finally, in 2021, working with Makeflix, all 11 of the Cant Blood films were bundled together in a 2-disc Blu-ray set, which should, in theory, be in stock on their site right now. It's sold out at the time of writing, but they said they were restocking. And you know what? Even on the release for this one, I still don't get a break. The disc included in the 2021 11 film release is just a repackaging of the 3D double feature Blu-ray release from 2011, and both films featured on this disc are, as far as I can tell, just the original DVD masters unceremoniously upscaled and dumped on disc. There's tons of pixelation dotted throughout, chromatic aberrations run rife. It's a dismal release for this one, and I wasn't expecting much, but I'd have at least thought for this release they'd have struck a HD copy from the original VHS master, not just upscaling the existing DVD master and slapping it on a Blu-ray. There's no extras on the double feature disc either, just a crap ton of previews of what look like 3D demo movies. Like, there's one going around a theme park, one going through some woods, it's just super underwhelming. Had this had a stable HD transfer, maybe a commentary track, or even just an interview with the filmmaker included, I'd have thought it was value for money. But it comes to something when this 11 film set works out at about $3 to $4 a film, and I think they're overcharging. Jesus. Cant Blood is a short, simple plotted slasher that exists to give the viewer a slasher experience in under 80 minutes. And that's me being kind about it. Had this not been the writer and director's first feature film, I'd have probably been a lot harsher with this one. As it stands, I kind of feel obliged to almost give it something approaching a free pass. This was someone's learning curve, and I don't feel like I can be venomous about someone's first steps into something, because we all suck when we start out learning something new. This film isn't great, it's slow, plodding, riddled with technical and continuity issues, with bland acting, flat direction, cine that's fundamentally broken, and a soundtrack on the verge of death, but it's a film that got made and released in spite of its flaws, and for someone's first film to actually get a professional release, well, that's got to be celebrated, for better or worse. Look, all I'm saying is I have 10 more of these movies to get through now, and now that Brad's cut his teeth on this thing, I really hope that Camp 2 is a step up. I really do.